Hello, it's Lord Slar here, come back in another video, and the topic of today's is a Season 1 review. So before I get into anything about this video, I just need to give a huge shout out to Harry Gilbank, or Full Circle Media. There'll be a link in the description to his channel, and he's been very nice and made all the thumbnails and, pictures I use in the video and stuff, for this video, and they look great. They really enhance the video, I think, and I hope that, you appreciate them, and you should really go check out his channel. He's got some cool content on there, some funny shorts, and some very good reviews as well. But anyway, on to this video. So I'm planning, not all at once, but just over time to review every single season of Doctor Who. Obviously, I'm not just going to go week after week. It's just going to be occasionally, like, every month or every odd month, whatever. Just whenever I feel like it, reviewing a season. The aim being that if you want to know my opinions on any episode in particular, you just go click on the corresponding season and then be like, oh, well, that's what I think about the video. And also because it's a lot of fun, and I can, share my opinion on every single episode ever made with you. I think that's pretty handy, and so without further ado, let's get on with the video. Before I start the video, I think I'll explain the format of how I'm ranking these stories. I'm not doing a usual, 1 out of 10, 5 out of 10, 10 out of 10, that kind of thing, because that system's very subjective, and while I have been guilty of using it myself, there's some people who think, oh, 7 out of 10 means good, 6 out of 10 means bad, when actually 5 out of 10 means average, and 6 out of 10 is actually a good review. You see, it's purely subjective. Everybody has a different opinion, so I've decided to do it differently, so it's a little more clear. There's still some subjectivity to it, but it's more clear than that. So the different rankings are: it starts off with terrible, which is reserved only for the worst episodes, which are just hate them, and they're awful, and they've just got so much wrong with them. They're not worthy of any merit in particular. Bad is just for bad episodes. They're not that good, they're not that bad, but they're still bad enough to warrant not being liked. You've got mediocre episodes, or average episodes as I'm calling them here. They're just middle of the road. They're alright. They've got some good things going for them, but there's some parts which drag it down quite a lot. Good episodes, these are the episodes which you do recommend watching. They've still got a lot of flaws, but they're still very, very good and very, very fun to watch. Great episodes are episodes which go above the Call of Duty, or at least you personally really, really like them. This is the kind of episodes which you're really into and you would thoroughly recommend. And right at the top, you've got Masterpiece, which is reserved for some of the best and quintessential episodes of Doctor Who, at least in my opinion, that you just love to pieces. And that's the system. And yeah, so let's get on with the rest of the video. An Unearthly Child. So, An Unearthly Child is the first ever episode of Doctor Who, as you all well know, and if you don't, well, are you really a fan? This is just something that everybody who watches Doctor Who should know. And so how does it start? With a boom, with a bang, or just with a bit of shit? Because, not everything starts off well. For example, Blackadder, the season 1, is absolutely shit, but after that it gets to, be one of the greatest British television shows of all time. But how does Doctor Who start? Well, in the case of part 1, we'll get into the other parts later, but part 1 itself is absolutely brilliant. It's done really, really well. It's got a great kind of mystery to it, which in hindsight, obviously we know what's going to happen, but back in the day, back in 1963, especially as there wasn't that many sci-fi shows on, it would have been an interesting mystery, which built up to the reveal of Doctor and the TARDIS. It was revolutionary stuff for its time, really new, and I imagine it would have got people really intrigued, and even now, it's still magical to watch, not just because it's the first episode. Objectively, it's just very, very good, very enjoyable, great sense of mystery, and it works really well. However, despite starting very well, it goes very far downhill after part 1. Episodes 2, 3 and 4 are really draggy and very, very dull. And you won't see me say this about many Hartnell episodes. I don't know, there's a lot of people that just point the finger at all the classic Who episodes, especially in the Hartnell era, so, oh, they're dull and stuff. I'm not like that. I absolutely love the 60s. I love the Hartnell era. And maybe it's just because, I can watch longer things without getting bored most of the time, but this is genuinely boring, and it all comes down to the fact that caveman politics isn't interesting. You see, what works about the other pure historicals is that they're set in eras that we know a lot about, we can say a lot about, you can teach the audience a lot about, so it should interest them, at least people who find history interesting. However, with, 100,000 BC, which is when this is set, in caveman times, we don't know much about this, there's not much to teach, and to be honest, it's a bit silly. Like, it's just seeing all these cavemen speak fairly poshly, well, not poshly, but like, with a lot more complicated language than they probably would have, and it's just making fire. It's not interesting. It's not interesting to an audience, and that's the main problem with this episode. Nobody cares about caveman politics and, the history of cavemen. Well, I mean, okay, there is something to be said about the history of cavemen, but it's not the kind of thing that translates well into a Doctor Who episode, I don't think, especially in the pure historical format. It may have worked better had it been like a pseudo historical, but that format hadn't been invented yet, so it didn't really work. Despite this, the regular cast has done rather well. I mean, sure, the cavemen characters aren't really interesting at all, and even though there are some good actors, they're just not given good roles enough for me to praise it in any way. But the regular cast, they do good, and it's very enjoyable. And I've heard a lot of people actually get quite shocked while watching this. They don't expect the Doctor to start smoking a pipe or trying to kill a caveman because he's slowing the group down. It really shows how the Doctor develops, because Hartnell has the most, character development of a Doctor of all time, and season one is definitely a season which shows that. I'll kind of really sum that up at the end of this video when I sum up my thoughts on season one, but you can see in this story he's an absolute bastard, and and that's just how he started off. He had to warm up to people. He didn't just start off as this amazing destined hero. He was just a bastard to start with, and I like that. I really like that. I don't know why. It just works for me. Overall, this episode is average, while parts 2, 3, and 4 really do drag the story down, being very dull, draggy, uninteresting, and, overall just bad and a bad idea in general. Part 1 is really good. It manages to drag up that bad to an average because part 1 is so good. I'd almost say it was like a masterpiece, the episode 1. However, the rest of it really does drag it down to an average, and there's nothing you can do about that, unfortunately. So yeah, Unearthly Child gets an average. The Daleks. Leaving behind what was just generally a bad idea, the Daleks is where Doctor Who really started. I mean, it's just brilliant from start to finish. I mean, admittedly, parts 1 to 5 are definitely my favourite, some of the best Doctor Who of all time there. It's done so well. It's got a great story, some great sets, great score, great direction, great atmosphere, great characters. It just works. It works really, really, really well. So let's go a bit in depth about the production standards of this story. So admittedly it was on a low budget, but man, it managed to do some good stuff. I mean, the jungle looks fantastic, and while the jungle looks good, the swamp, though, the swamp really, it just looks brilliant. It's one of the best Hartnell sets by far. Just a lot of effort and a lot of cares clearly went into it, and it looked great. The direction of the episode is also amazing, because you get quite a few very good scenes, especially the part 1 cliffhanger where you just see the sucker of the Dalek. Obviously, people haven't seen the Daleks yet, so they're like, what's this? Like, it leaves you in suspense for a week. I believe I talked about this in my top 5 cliffhangers episode. There's also some really good shots, like, for example, in the part 4 cliffhanger, where it goes from face to face when they realise that they've left the fluid link down in the Dalek City. It's just moments like that which shows the director knew what he was doing. Sure, there's a few fluff-ups here and there, like where the camera isn't quite on the characters, but, they didn't have much budget. A lot of people on it were inexperienced, and I think, I don't know if it was that episode, but there was a few episodes where they were in a really small, not very good studio, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the reason for it, but it's still done really well. And the score, I just talked about it in the, just the last bit, but the score, I just need to reiterate, Tristram Carey did a brilliant job, absolutely revolutionary for its time. It's dark, it's foreboding, it's atmospheric, and it just works, especially for this episode, and it's no surprise it was reused in later episodes, like, a lot of the Dalek ones and the Rescue and the Ark, and I never get sick of it, despite the fact it was used so many times, because it's so good. The Daleks are also done really well in this story. They've got a different portrayal as they have in other stories. While they are still a bit hateful towards the Thals, they're mainly very calculating and scientific. I don't really get as much of the fanaticism which I do get in later episodes, which isn't a bad or a good thing. It just works for this particular episode, whereas in Power of the Daleks it works that they're very fanatic. And yeah, the Daleks done well, and while they don't kill a whole lot of people, it certainly shows that they've caused a lot of pain by the end of the story. So this is one of those stories which has a deeper meaning, a message if you will, and this one is about the horrors of nuclear or neutronic war, and obviously in the 1960s the world was constantly looming over that prospect, and the Cuban Missile Crisis was only a year before this story aired. Unlike some stories like Kill the Moon, which has a message, it's not so one-sided, it's not trying to make one side look bad, like, in kind of debates that were going on at the time, and the other look, good. It was actually pretty well balanced. It was showing that, yeah, you don't want to be a warmonger. Look at what happened to the world, like of Skaro. It was absolutely horrific. That could happen to this planet. But at the same time, it's showing you can't just be pacifists. You have to be willing to fight if you've got an enemy which is going to destroy you, which is the Daleks. You can't just give up if you're threatened. And I believe the line was in the story, there's a terrible shame in being afraid to live. I think that worked really well. It was a really good message by Terry Nation and done better than a lot of other stories have in future episodes of Doctor Who. Overall, The Daleks is a masterpiece. It's got brilliant sets, brilliant score, brilliant direction, just brilliant everything. It works so well. I've already talked about it before, and while there is a little dip in episode 6 and 7, they're still a really good watch, and this is more or less the episode that secured Doctor Who's place in history. This is the reason why it's here today. Sure, there's been a few bumps along the way, and there's been other episodes which has definitely launched it into fame, but this is the reason why it got popular in the first place, and Doctor Who fan must watch or relinquish their status as fan. The Edge of Destruction. The Edge of Destruction's a funny little story. Originally made as filler content in between the gaps, it actually works really well at gelling together this season, because in An Unearthly Child and the Daleks there's quite a lot of friction between the TARDIS crew. However, by Marco Polo that seemingly goes, and I think this story does quite a good way of showing how that happened, why that happened, rather than making the development just seem like it's jumping from track to track. Because a lot of awful stuff happens here. They're trapped together in a confined space while all this psychedelic, brain fucking stuff happens, and they do some horrible things to each other. Like the first Doctor threatens to throw Ian and Barbara off the TARDIS because he thinks that they did what's going wrong with the ship, even though he doesn't really have much episode that they do. But by the end they kind of make up, and even though he doesn't directly say it, the first Doctor clearly is apologetic towards them, which you can tell that by now they know him and this is the best they're going to get with him, and they're happy with that, and by the end they're getting on, and that really makes sense, and that's one really well written part about this story. However, despite the great character development and the very good atmosphere of this story, it has one pretty huge problem, and that is that it's just really, really, really stupid. I mean, spoilers for those who haven't watched it. The reason that the TARDIS, wasn't working or was doing all this weird shit was because he'd left the button pressed in. Just what? That's such a stupid Doctor Who plot. I mean, the fact it puts them through all that, like, the TARDIS isn't malfunctioning hugely, but it just puts them through all this shit just to warn them that the button's been pressed in, is weird. And I don't know, I just don't buy that this is how the TARDIS works. Like, this is how the warning system of the TARDIS works, because it's just kind of, there's a lot of leaps that you've got to do to be like, oh yeah, this means that and that means this. Why can't they just outright, put text on the screen rather than like make clocks appear out of nowhere and open the doors and scare the living daylights out of everybody? It's just dumb. It's really dumb, and it really takes away from this episode for me, especially since it's only 2 episodes. Just, David Whittaker is one of my favourite writers, but I honestly don't know what he was thinking when he came up with such a weird idea. Overall, I'd say this episode is average. Despite having some very good moments, I just can't get over how dumb the idea is. I know that it kind of does all it can in 2 episodes, but still, I can't help but it feeling a little underwhelming and just a little stupid in comparison to the rest of season 1. And I'm pretty confident that I'd say it's average, although it could be good if if the idea made a little more sense to me. Marco Polo. Marco Polo is the first proper pure historical story, and the first story written by John Lucarotti, and man, he shows how it's done really well and just shows why An Unearthly Child was so crap. I mean, this story has some brilliant acting in it and some brilliant characters, which, to be honest, is the best part of the story. It's mainly about its characters. Dagon is kind of a love to hate kind of character. Ping Cho's pretty good. You want Susan and her to get on because they've got some good chemistry together. And to be honest, I don't actually mind Susan in this episode, which is an achievement. And Marco Polo himself is just, I love him. He's such a conflicted, but underneath it all, a nice person. And the Mighty Khan's also another good one. He's quite funny, and he kind of works well with Hartnell. I think they have a bit of a chemistry going on, even though they're not in a whole lot of scenes. It works well for me. However, as a pure historical, it's really, really well researched. I mean, it's got some absolutely beautiful sets and costumes. I was lucky enough to be able to see some of the costumes myself at the Who shop in London, and it just looks really nice. Sure, the Gobi Desert sets look a bit meh, but the indoor sets look lovely, and I've actually got on DVD the Marco Polo reconstruction, but colorized, and it looks really, just really, really, really nice. And it's also a very informative episode as well, as in you're learning about ancient China. I certainly know more than I did before I watched this episode, but it's fun. Like, you don't notice you're learning, and that's how a good pure historical should work. It should teach you about the place. It can get away with a few artistic licenses, but it should teach you about the period without realizing that you're actually learning about it. And this story does it really, really well. In terms of plot, there isn't actually a whole lot for this story, but nonetheless, it's really, really, really good because the main focal point, as I said earlier, is the characters, the interactions between the TARDIS crew and, the Marco Polo's caravan, and it's really fun. It's really good. It's conflicted. There's a lot of arguments, but you can tell in different circumstances they could have been really good friends. Uh, it works, as well as it makes history feel dangerous, as all good Hartnell pure historicals do, and they really have to work to get the TARDIS back in the end, and eventually they get it off of Marco, which kind of makes up for the fact that he did take the TARDIS from them, and yeah, it's just a lovely, really, really nice little story, which it eloquently shows how a pure historical should be done. Overall, I have no hesitation in giving this story a masterpiece. Some of you might find that a little controversial because I know there's some people which think it's a bit dull and there's others which are like, yeah, it's good, but is it that good? I personally think it is. I mean, this is more of a subjective opinion on this story, but it's just such a really lovely, really nice little story which does the pure historical format perfectly and being the first proper one and is still the best to date. Not that many have been done recently, but still, that's my opinion. The Keys of Marinus. Objectively, this story is absolutely crap. However, in my subjective opinion, it's 2 hours and 20 minutes of unbridled, unfettered, fucking fun. Sometimes you need these fun stories just to break the mold, and there's not a moment this gets boring, not a moment it holds up. It's always throwing new stuff at you, and it's just pure enjoyment in Doctor Who form. I mean, sure, there's plenty wrong with it. You can pick nits all day because some of these nits are so large they're actually man-sized, but still, I can't help it. I can't help but love this story. So as you may know, this story has quite a few locations in it, and that's because they have to go to different parts of the planet Marinus to get the keys, and all of these locations is very distinct, very diverse, and you learn a lot about this planet while you're there. Maybe not as the planet as a whole, but just of the different locations you visit, and that's what makes it such fun. It's got a brilliant sense of adventure, and I just can't help but love it. Now, I think I'm going to have to do a solus review on this story, outside of this video, because obviously there's a lot of talk about there being the different locations. So for now, I'm just going to say what I've said and move on to the conclusion, and if you want to know my thoughts later on, maybe a few weeks, few months, I'll thought out a Keys of Marinus review for you. Overall, I think it's a great story. I mean, it's just so much unbridled fun. I can't help but give it such merit. And I know there's a lot of people who are going to be like, but why? It's objectively crap. Just piss off. Let me have my fun. The Aztecs. The Aztecs is another John Le Carrotti pure historical which defines the genre. I mean, while I don't think it's as good as Marco Polo, it's really, really up there and explores some themes which have been very important to Doctor Who. because it explores the themes of you not being able to change time. Sure, later in Doctor Who, it's kind of messed around with, and no matter what kind of conclusion or hypothesis or theory you come up with for the laws of time, there's always going to be an inconsistency somewhere in Doctor Who because there's just so much of it. And obviously, back in the classic series, you couldn't really go back and watch the older episodes very easily or like read the script. So sometimes that did lead to quite a few inconsistencies, but here it was kind of needed because it was in its infancy. You need to explain these things to the brand new audience, and it's done really well in a very emotional way, in a way which really develops Barbara's character a lot because she's kind of been left alone for the most part, aside from the Daleks, where she gets quite a lot of good scenes. But this is the story where she really shines. She does shine in other stories in the future, like The Crusade in particular, but she puts in a brilliant performance and just works really well with William Hartnell, and it's just amazing to watch, and was definitely a very important episode in terms of can you change time, even though it doesn't really work with all of the future episodes, but that's just how it is sometimes. So, like Marco Polo, this has some brilliant characters and some brilliant acting. While there's a lot more focus on the plot here, the characters still play a huge role, and it's very tense to watch the kind of debate: is Barbara actually a god? If is she not? Like that's constantly going on, and you're like, oh, I don't want this to go wrong for the TARDIS crew. It genuinely gets you on the edge of your seat, which is always good because back in the day, like back in the 60s, Doctor Who did feel dangerous, whereas it feels a bit safe these days, and that's one of the reasons why this episode really, really works for what it's doing. As well as this, it also has some quite good educational factors. While it's not as good as Marco Polo in telling you about the time period, it still does a pretty good job, and I know quite a few facts about the Aztecs than I did, well, at least more than I did before I watched the story. Or I was like, oh, there's some fuckers who rip out hearts. Obviously, there's a lot more to them than that, and this story taught me. Overall, The Aztecs is a great episode. It's so close to being a masterpiece, but I feel like the script could have been a little more tight, and that would have made it a lot better. But yeah, it's very close to being a masterpiece, but just not quite there. Just like how Marco Polo is only just a masterpiece, and it's still pretty much quintessential Doctor Who. It raises some good ideas, and it's a very, very good episode, which I highly recommend you check out. The Sensorites. Despite being hated by most of the Doctor Who community, I really, really like this story. It's just done well for me. I mean, it's got some great science, got a great atmosphere, and got some great political intrigue. I mean, the atmosphere pretty much pervades the entire story, as with a lot of the black and white era, as long as it isn't boring, which I know a lot of people are keen to label this story as, but I think it's got enough interesting things to really keep me entertained throughout the entire thing, which is a pretty good feat for 6 episodes. It's got some great science in, which a lot of the Hartnell stories do, but this one has quite a lot in particular, and I like that because Doctor Who is a science fiction, and he shouldn't just get out of situations by waving his magic wand around. An example in this story would be when the Sensorites, he looks and sees they have kind of, I've forgotten exactly what it was, it might have been dilated eyes, something like that. It's like, oh, well, that must mean that they mustn't like the dark. So he switched off the lights, and that's how he manages to get out one of the situations, which I think that's clever. That's what Doctor Who should be about. And it makes him seem like a much more intelligent character, and honestly makes for much better and more interesting viewing than it would do otherwise, compared to like New Who, where he just uses the sonic screwdriver all the time. However, easily the biggest part and the most interesting part of this episode is the political intrigue. You really get a know about the Sensorites and their politics, and I think that works really well. It's not just kind of where the aliens are brushed over as all bad. There's some that are good, some that are bad, and you really get to learn about them, which I quite like. I like to see the cultures and how other societies work in Doctor Who, and it really works really well in this episode. And the evil Sensorite, the city administrator, is such a dislikable bastard. And that works for me. You've got to have villains that you hate, and I think the Hartnell era does that quite well. It's got some really, really dislikable characters, but like in a kind of love to hate kind of way. It's done really well, written really well, and really interesting. It keeps me going throughout the entire 6 episodes. Overall, The Sensorites is a great episode, even if only just. While I enjoy it a lot, I can completely understand why people would say it was dull, and it could certainly do with a bit tightening up on the script. And while it isn't the most revolutionary episode, it's certainly an important one, as it's one where you really get a look into these strange aliens' culture, which is something which has been done again and again in Doctor Who, and is something which is very good to do and should be done more, to be perfectly honest. The Reign of Terror. So the series finale for season 1 was The Reign of Terror, and it was a brilliant one to go out on. It again, like the other pure historicals, it's got some great characters, if not as good this time, but it makes up for that for having a really, really good plot and some amazing moments. It's written by Dennis Spooner, so naturally has some funny moments. My favourite of these is definitely when he manages to, bluff his way out of the, well, not bluff, but kind of trick his way out of the person who's making the people who haven't paid the taxes work on the road, because he basically enslaves the first Doctor. He manages to, basically manipulate him and get his way out of it, and that's always really, really fun to watch. And again, like the other pure historicals, this one feels really dangerous, but definitely the most of the lot. And obviously it should, considering it's the reign of terror in the French Revolution, which was a very, very, very dangerous time to live. And again, it does a history lesson. It does a history lesson very well, except for obviously it raises the questions that are often asked about the French Revolution, like was it justified, etc., etc. And just like the Daleks, it has a very balanced perspective. It's not like, oh, Louis should have stayed on the throne and all that. It sympathises with, all the people who are doing the terror, but says it is a bad thing, it is a horrible thing, but, you were pushed and oppressed to that point. It's a very balanced view of the French Revolution, and I think that's good, and that's exactly what they should have went with. This is also a very, very well directed story. It has some great costumes, some pretty good sets, and a brilliant score by Stanley Myers, which is highly, highly enjoyable, especially the kind of upbeat bit of it, which you can actually find on YouTube. It's also got some very, very tense cliffhangers, which are done very well, especially when the fire overlaps the credits at the end of part 1. And if I'd remembered, and well, if I indeed redone my top 5 cliffhangers again, that would easily get a place on it, as it's just brilliant, especially the fire overlapping the credits. I can't stress enough how just cool that is. I mean, back in the day, people would be like, whoa, that looks brilliant, and it still looks great to this day. Overall, The Reign of Terror is a very, very solid, great episode. It's so enjoyable, it's got a lot of good things going for it, it's very well written, and it's actually William Hartnell's favourite episode, so, the man himself says it's the best, so we can hardly deny him saying it's really, really good, and I'm happy to give it that accolade. Thus ends my Season 1 review, and as you may know from my top 5 seasons video, this is one of my all-time favourite seasons. I mean, there's not really a bad story in here. There's so much good, even if it falters a little bit at the beginning, and it's honestly hard to believe that this is the very first season of something so new and revolutionary at the time, because it's just done really well. It's got some great ideas, it's full to the brim of imagination and a brilliant sense of adventure, which, while it has been done since, it's definitely at its best here. I mean, sense of adventure is kind of lost in quite a lot of later Who, but in the Hartnell era, specifically this one, it's there and it's a lot of fun. It really grips you into the episodes, and plus it's good to mention that this has probably the best character development for the Doctor in all of Doctor Who. So yeah, that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you back next time in another one.